Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name's Kaylee and these are my books. So for today's video, I have a fun fantasy book recommendation video that is styled in the format of if you like this book, you should try this other book. And I'm assuming most people have seen these kind of videos. They're very popular on BookTube, very fun on BookTube, but I've never done one before. So this is my first go at it and I am excited. Basically, I will be talking about a popular book and saying if you like this popular book, you should try this less popular book. Now, this does go both ways, so if you've tried the less popular book and you enjoyed it, you can then go ahead and reverse the recommendation and try the popular book. And I'm grouping these books together because I think there is potential for someone who liked one of the books to like the other book, either based off of the plot, the characters, the overall tone of the book, the writing style of the book, etc., etc. I'll try to make it clear why I think someone may enjoy both of the books as I'm talking about these recommendations. But I do have 11 of these to go over, which means I have 22 books to talk about. So I'm not going to be giving super detailed plot synopses throughout this video. If you would like to know more about the plot synopsis, you can leave a comment down below and I can talk more about it in the comments. But for this video, I wanted to keep the plot synopsis a little bit tighter. That way I have more room to talk about why I think one person may enjoy both of these books. And I am focusing fully on fantasy books for this video because I am hoping this video is helpful for people participating in Realmathon, which is Cassidy from Covers with Cassidy's readathon in April. I am one of the co-hosts and I am a team leader for the fantasy group, and therefore I'm trying to get out as many fantasy book recommendation videos as possible. However, even if you're not participating in Realmathon, I hope this video is still helpful and you can find some new fantasy book favorites. I have a big mix of fantasy subgenres here. I have some fantasy romance, I have some epic fantasy, I have some cozy fantasy, so on and so forth. So let's just jump into the main meat of the video, and I think if you like The Name of the Wind, you should try the Rune of Kings. The Name of the Wind has around 800,000 ratings on Goodreads, and the Rune of Kings only has around 11,000, so sad. These are both epic adult fantasies, and the reason why I think you could like both of them if you like one or the other is because I find the structure and the writing style very similar. In The Name of the Wind, our main character is kind of telling his story from a more future point of view, and that is the same as in the Rune of Kings. We have our main character telling his story from a more future point of view. Also, I think part of both of these books is actually how the character is telling the story. So it is in the plot that they are writing down their story, that they are telling the story for a particular audience in the actual book. So it's a bit meta because they're talking about how their audience is going to interpret certain things, so on and so forth. And of course the audience is in the book because these are being written down for actual people in the book. But we are also the audience, so it's kind of a bit meta. It plays with that style a little bit, and that's why I think these have very similar vibes to it. Now, the plot themselves are fairly different. I mean, we have the basics of our main male character growing up from a kid to an adult and becoming more and more powerful as we are following along. They both have chosen one tropes, but this one plays around with that trope a little bit more because it's potentially the chosen villain trope, which is cool. They both kind of have bard-like characters. But yeah, basically when I was reading the Rune of Kings the entire time, I was like, this feels similar to The Name of the Wind. So I think if you've read this and enjoyed it, you should definitely try picking up the Rune of Kings. Next up, if you liked Throne of Glass, you should try The Prison Healer. Throne of Glass has about 1 million reviews on Goodreads, and Prison Healer has 33,000 ratings on Goodreads. Both are fairly popular, but of course Throne of Glass is much more popular. But these books just gave me such similar feels. So these are both young adult series that are in the older young adult section, but definitely firmly in young adult in my opinion. And the characters just feel similar. They both have strong plot lines of fantasy romance. Throne of Glass is following Selena after she has just gotten out of jail and is having to compete in these trials to win her freedom. And that is very similar to Prison Healer. We follow our main character who is currently in prison and having to compete in trials to win her freedom. Both of these books play around with hidden identities. They play around with royalty. Both of these books have our kind of lower down female characters who are both in prison or just out of prison being thrown into this world of politics and nobility and prince and princesses and the royals suddenly take an interest in both of them. But it seems like both of them have quite a large secret about who they really are and what they are really capable of. When I was reading The Prison Healer, it felt very similar in vibes to Throne of Glass. Of course, the plot itself is quite different. The Prison Healer, actually all takes place in the prison, which is really fun in my opinion. I love a prison setting. I think the prison setting is just like one of the top tier settings in fantasy. I wish more books would have prison settings. It's just so brutal, and I love a brutal setting. Now, I can't speak for how this series, the rest of the series, compares to the rest of the series in Throne of Glass because I haven't read the entire series for Prison Healer, but I do think there are some direct comparisons that can be made between these two first books in the series. Next up is another Sarah J. Maas connection, because I think if you liked A Court of Thorns and Roses, you should try these Hollow Vows. Court of Thorns and Roses has around 1.4 million reviews on Goodreads, and These Hollow Vows has around 58,000 reviews on Goodreads. Again, they're both popular, but one is clearly more popular than the other. And I want to be clear and say that I am comparing these two specific books, not the entire rest of the series. I think if you specifically like A Court of Thorns and Roses, the book itself, not the next couple books. I mean, you can like the next couple books, but I think this book is similar to this first book, not to the rest of the books in the series, if that makes sense. I hope it does. I just don't want to give you any false advertising. But both of these deal with a human being thrown into these very wild, kind of sexy, yet very scary fae courts because they care about protecting those that they love. Of course, Feyre in A Court of Thorns and Roses gets thrown into the world for hunting for her family, and our main character in These Hollow Vows gets thrown into the world because she is trying to find her human sister that she thinks is in the Fey world somewhere. These Hollow Vows, in my opinion, is so clearly inspired by A Court of Thorns and Roses. It's very easy to draw comparisons between the two. There are two different Fey male characters that our female character is interested in, so this book does have a love triangle, but I get very annoyed with love triangles, and I actually found this love triangle really fun. So if you're a little bit skeptical about love triangles, still give this one a try. I thought it was well done. These are both such a fun time, and I really think if you are a big ACOTAR fan, this one you're gonna have a good time with. Will you love it as much of ACOTAR? I don't think so, but is it still definitely worth a read? Yes. Next up, if you liked Ninth House, I think you should try House of Hunger. Ninth House has 200,000 reviews on Goodreads, and House of Hunger only has around 7,000 reviews on Goodreads, and I think these have such similar feels to them. Now, the plots are entirely different. There's not a lot of comparisons to be drawn between these plots, but these are both, in my opinion, about 50% fantasy, 50% horror. So if you want a very dark, creepy horror fantasy, these are your books to read. And so because of that, if you liked all the vibes that you were getting in Ninth House, you can get those same vibes in House of Hunger. And this, similarly to Ninth House, is about a main female character who kind of gets thrown into this world and doesn't really know what's going on. And so we're finding out about things along with our main character in here. Now, in terms of plot, it's really different because Ninth House, as you probably know, is dark academia plot about, and it's urban fantasy as well, about Alex kind of finding these secret magical societies at Yale, where this is not urban fantasy. This is actually set in a fantasy world, and this is about our main character being poor and having to be a blood maid, which basically means she's letting rich people drink her blood, and these rich people are very much adjacent to being vampires. But there is world building in this book because it's set in a fantasy world, and there are some like interesting politics between the noble houses in this world that is very reminiscent of fantasy books too. And so I consider this a hybrid genre between fantasy and horror. And this is actually one of my host favorites for Realmathon. So if you're participating in Realmathon and watching this video still trying to figure out what to read, I definitely recommend my host favorite, especially if you liked Ninth House. But at the end of the day, both of these books excelled in their spooky imagery along with the magical worlds that were built up, while this one was in our real world and this one was in a fantasy world. Next up, if you liked The Bear and the Nightingale, I think you should try Gods of Jade and Shadow. The Bear and the Nightingale has around 175,000 reviews on Goodreads, and Gods of Jade and Shadow has around 65,000 reviews on Goodreads. Now, I think the interesting thing about Gods of Jade and Shadow is I don't see it talked about much on Fantasy BookTube. Maybe it is, maybe I'm just missing those conversations, but I feel like this book was more popular with a more general audience, not like the BookTube audience, whereas The Bear and the Nightingale is very popular on BookTube. So even though this book is fairly similar-ish in popularity to The Bear and the Nightingale, I still wanted to put it in this video. I think more people on Fantasy BookTube should be talking about this book, especially if you liked The Bear and the Nightingale. So the reason why I'm putting these two books in conversation with each other is both of these are a more whimsical, atmospheric fantasy, and both of these are historical fantasy, and both of these have very heavy mythological influences for the stories. The Bear and the Nightingale is about Russian folklore, and Gods of Jade and Shadow is about Mayan mythology. And now the atmospheres that are created between these two books are very different. Bear and the Nightingale, as you can probably tell, is all about that cold, icy atmosphere, and Gods of Jade and Shadow is more about really making you feel like you're in the Jazz Age in Mexico. While the atmospheres that are created are entirely different, they are both extremely successful at making you feel like you are there. The Bear and the Nightingale is a trilogy, and Gods of Jade and Shadow is actually just a standalone, so this is a great fantasy book to pick up if you don't want to commit to a larger series. And it's only around 320 pages, so very, very low commitment read. Next up, if you like House of Earth and Blood, I think you should try Blood Fever, which is book 1 in the Fever series. Now, these are both urban fantasy series that also have a very slow burn romance in them, where you're going to feel lots of romantic tension throughout these books. Crescent City has around 370,000 reviews on Goodreads, and Blood Fever has around 170,000 reviews on Goodreads. And this is another case, well, yes, these are both very, very popular. I think the Fever series was popular a little bit ago and isn't currently super popular on BookTube. And part of that is because these books are older and therefore people have already read them. But I didn't know about them back when they were super popular, and I found out about them way later. So I'm making this video and having this be the less popular book, because if you haven't heard about this series, if you weren't reading when these books were really popular, if you didn't like this type of genre when these books were really popular, you should go back and revisit the Fever series. Both of these are urban fantasies that have a super slow burn romance throughout them, but that slow burn is filled with such delicious romantic tension throughout these books. And both have a seemingly ordinary girl having to be thrown into this bigger world, and yet these seemingly ordinary girls may have some secrets of their own. And both of these books have a murder mystery as the central plot line. In House of Earth and Blood, Bryce is trying to figure out who murdered her friends, and in Blood Fever and in the whole Fever series, Michaela is trying to figure out who murdered her sister. The vibes between these series are just so comparable because the plot and the general feel are so similar. We have main characters who are unapologetically themselves, and it's a take it or leave it attitude if people like them or not. And the character development that both of these main characters go through is so satisfying to watch. I do want to give a heads up that the Fever series has many, many triggers in it. It is a dark fantasy romance series, and so definitely check trigger warnings if that's something you need to do, because there are many, many triggers. Next up, I don't own these books physically, but if you liked Under the Whispering Door, I think you should try Legends and Lattes. Under the Whispering Door has around 130,000 reviews, and Legends and Lattes has around 60,000 reviews. Under the Whispering Door and Legends and Lattes are just so similar, I had to briefly mention them just in case anyone was unaware at how similar they are, because both of them are so beloved by so many people that I think if you like one, you really, really have the potential to like the other, because they're both cozy fantasy, they both have very sweet romances in them, and they both are focused on these like magical tea/coffee shops. Under the Whispering Door is about this tea shop, and Legends and Lattes is about a coffee shop, but the production of the coffee in the coffee shop and the production of the tea in the tea shop are both central to the plot. And this is something so unique in fantasy books. The fact that they both have them, that they both have a whimsical vibe to them, that they both have these sweet romances in it, that they both have a cozy feel, like they're just so similar. I would bet money if you like one, then you'll like the other. I mean, I'm not actually gonna bet any money because reading is so subjective, but I just feel strongly about the comparison between these two books. Next up, if you liked The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, I think you should try The Umbral Storm. Now, The Way of Kings has 420,000 reviews on Goodreads, and Umbral Storm has less than 1,000. Umbral Storm is actually a self-published fantasy book that was just recently released, and it is a Spiffbo finalist. I recently did a vlog where I read this book. I'll leave it linked below just in case you want more information about it. But this is a comparison because I found that some of the magic system and some of the world building felt really similar between the two books. So The Way of Kings starts with, there's a couple different point of views, but I'm going to focus on Cal in this book because Cal is the character that I think has the most direct comparison to the Umbral Storm. And so Cal starts as this man who is in a very, very low position in the army and is basically a slave in the army and is going to get killed off, but then he is able to find some hidden powers within himself and he doesn't seem to die in any of these battles that he should be dying. So an exploration of magic, an exploration of his rise from zero to hero, and that is just so similar to Umbral Storm because Umbral Storm also starts with our main character Darren. Again, there's other point of views, but I'm just focusing on Darren because I think this is the most direct comparison between these two books. Darren starts as an indentured servant in this really dangerous slavers world, and then he finds some hidden power within himself that kind of pushes him out of that stage of life and into another. Both of these books' progression system of the magic felt fairly similar. Both of these books' character development of our heroic characters felt similar. While I think The Way of Kings is the much stronger book, Umbral Storm did have some writing issues in my opinion. I still think you will enjoy the Umbral Storm if you enjoyed The Way of Kings. Will the Umbral Storm become a new favorite all-time book? I don't know about that, but I do think it's worth a read because I think it's such a fun time. And the Umbral Storm is on Kindle Unlimited, so if you have access to Kindle Unlimited, you don't even have to pay for it. You can just read it right on there. Next up, if you liked The City of Brass, I recommend you try out Ashes of the Sun. I promise this is City of Brass. I don't have the dust jacket for it, unfortunately, but I think these books are very similar in terms of approachability and focus on characters versus plot. City of Brass has around 93,000 reviews on Goodreads, and Ashes of the Sun has around 3,000 reviews, and while the plots are so different and not really comparable, I think the general tone of these two books is very similar. I think both of these are very approachable fantasy, so if you liked the level of fantasy in City of Brass and you're more intimidated by like the giant epic fantasy books, I think you will like Ashes of the Sun as well because it's approachable in a similar way that City of Brass is approachable. And both of these books, while they have full plots to them, don't get me wrong, like I think both of these books are both character focused and plot focused. I think that the plot focus in these books is on character relationships to add to a lot of the drama. Like City of Brass, part of the drama is just how these different characters are related to each other in this political world, in their romantic feelings towards each other, in their eventual convergence in the plot. And that is similar to Ashes of the Sun because we are following a brother and a sister as our main different point of views, and with them being on different sides of this political world, we're constantly on the edge of the seat when these brother and sister point of views will potentially converge and potentially diverge, if they're going to be able to reconcile a friendship with each other, if they're going to hate each other, and some of those will they won't they's is in City of Brass as well, and both of these do have romantic subplots. Now, I wouldn't classify either of these as fantasy romance, but both of them have a full fantasy plot with a strong romance subplot. I just don't think the romance subplot is a big enough part of these books for it to be fully fantasy romance, but that's up for debate. If you consider City of Brass fantasy romance, you may consider Ashes of the Sun fantasy romance too. And Ashes of the Sun, the romance, is a sapphic romance, which is always nice to see in fantasy books. Next up, if you liked Nevernight, I think you should try Red Sister. Nevernight has around 84,000 reviews and Red Sister has around 50,000 reviews, so they are fairly similar, but I feel like we don't have the same type of fantasy reader reading both of these, and I think they should be because these are so similar. So basically both of these have a kind of badass, kind of bratty main character. Both of them start when our main character is quite young and progresses throughout the series as they get older and older. And both of these follow these main characters figuring out how to be assassins. In Red Sister, Nona is becoming an assassin nun, and in Nevernight, Mia is becoming a more classical assassin. But both of these assassin schools that they are attending are big parts of the plot, and both of the assassin schools have religious elements, this one being assassin nuns, this one being like shadow gods and stuff, very cool. And both of the assassin schools are not just purely like physical schools, they have magic associated with them as well. So it's kind of like magic school setting, assassin school setting, and then these people going out and doing their missions. I just think both of these have some similar vibes going on in terms of the plot itself and in some of the characterization, that if you are hoping to read more about a fun assassin school like you did in Nevernight, try out Red Sister. And now moving into the last recommendation, and I don't own either of these books, but if you liked Good Omens, I recommend you try Small Miracles. Good Omens has around 675,000 reviews and Small Miracles has less than 1,000. But I think they are very similar in terms of the focus on characters, in terms of the writing style with the quirkiness in the writing, and in terms of just how wholesome the stories are, and this interaction between angels and demons. Now, I do think Good Omens is more fantasy forward than Small Miracles is. In fact, Small Miracles, the fantasy is very much in the background, and it's more focused on these humans and how these humans are going about their lives, becoming friends with potential angels and demons. Of course, the angels and demons do have powers in Small Miracles, so it's not like the angels and demons are just stand-ins for regular people. There are some very fun magical moments, but Good Omens, there are just many more magical moments. But in both of these books, we get very quirky characterizations of all of the characters, not just human characters, but also like the angel characters and the demon characters. We get unlikely friendships between angels and fallen angels or demons. I read Small Miracles in the same reading vlog where I read Umbral Storm, so that same link will be down below if you want any more information about Small Miracles. It's spoiler-free. But in the vlog, and I still stand by it today, I talked about how Small Miracles has been described as Good Omens meets The Good Place. I believe Rachel was the first one that said that, but it totally fits the vibe of Small Miracles. And so if you liked Good Omens, like The Good Place, then definitely try Small Miracles. Alright, those are all of the recommendations that I have for if you like this, try this for the fantasy version. I can do this with other genres in the next couple of months, so let me know down in the comments if you liked this style of video and I can try it out with some horror books, thriller books, romance books. It will take me a little bit to be able to do this again with fantasy books, just because I feel like I got all of the comparisons that I feel the most strongly about in this video. But if you really liked this video, I can keep a running list anytime I read a new fantasy book and it feels like a different fantasy book I've already read. That way I can eventually make another version of this video too. But if you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you next time. Bye!